So we're going to be looking at a section of Scripture here that, quite honestly, it's not a lot of fun because it points out some facts that are not fun to think about, but they are facts nonetheless. So we're going to get through them, and we're going to cover all the way, believe it or not, we're going all the way to the end of the first chapter today. Because as I was looking at this, you could spend an inordinate amount of time talking about every single thing, especially when we get to this laundry list that Paul gives of unrighteous or sinful behaviors. You could spend a long time looking at each one of those, which in the context of this lesson series, I don't think we have. So I choose rather to just kind of look at them and set them in the perspective of what Paul is trying to accomplish here in his teachings to the Romans. And let's remember once again that this book and this letter that Paul wrote of Romans was written to believers in Jesus Christ. And I think that is going to continually come back to us throughout this study. That's why is it, you might ask yourself the question over and over again, why is it important for a believer in Jesus Christ to understand these things? And that would be a good question to ask as you read the verses of Scripture. So I put them up there on the screen. It's hard to read. I'm just going to read it from my Bible. But we're going to go through the starting in verse 23 of the first chapter, and we'll go down to the end of the chapter. And he's talking about people now. We're kind of breaking into it here a little bit. But he's talking about people who have kind of rejected God in their mindset. And they choose to turn their back on God and pretty much live like an atheist, even if they don't pronounce themselves atheists. Like, God doesn't matter is perhaps one of the best ways we can put it. So he's talking about these people, and who is he talking to? He's talking to mankind at large, everybody. So whoever fits this description, that's who he's talking about. And he says, and they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore, because, right, God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections or passions. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one to another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet or right or just. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient or fitting, being filled with all ungodliness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Quite a list that Paul gives us here. And so, let's start to try to put this into a little bigger context of how the whole chapter is unfolding to us. So, one of the first things that we're going to look at is the fact that they were changing God's glory. Changing God's glory. So let's go back to verse 23. And he says that these people who turn their backs on God, they're actually changing God's glory. What kind of glory do you think Paul is talking about here? What does he mean, God's glory, in this context of this verse? Any ideas pop to your head? You can yeah, but what glory are we talking about? Say that again? Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's think about it in these terms. Does God have a glory? What is that?
His righteousness and holiness and purity and truth.
Okay. And what has Paul already talked about that God did that brings out all those attributes that were just mentioned? He's already talked about it in this chapter. And in fact, he says that when you look at this, it proves his glory, his existence, his creation, right? God's glory is the fact that he is the creator of all things. So, when you turn your back on God, you change that. So you change it from God creating everything, and it shows his great majesty, his glory, right? Because of the creation itself. You change that. What did they change it to? Right. So they were giving something or someone else what was truly only God's in the truth of the situation. So they changed God's glory of the fact that he created the heavens and the earth, and that when we look at those heavens and the earth, it gives us this external evidence of his glory, and they changed it into creature before the creator, and we'll get into more of that a little bit later. So what is the issue here? What happens when mankind changes God's glory and starts worshiping the creature rather than the creator? What is that? That's a form of what? Idolatry. Idolatry. And so that's the next point. This is the essence of idolatry. Have you ever heard somebody say, you can turn anything into an idol? I think there's some truth in that. And yet, in its ultimate sense, the essence of idolatry is taking away something from God, the God, and giving it to something else. Changing God's glory. So instead of believing in one God, one creator that has created all things, we're going to say, no, God, I'm going to take that away from you, and I'm going to put it over here. That's idolatry. That's idolatry in its most essence, the very root of it. But what people don't understand is that when you do that, we're going to get into some of these thoughts are all kind of, these verses are all kind of intermingled here. So I'm going to do my best to try to keep some, can't think of the word. Anyway, keep it in order. So what happens when we become idolatrous? When anyone becomes idolatrous in their life, they may think they are escaping slavery, but they're actually becoming a slave. Different kind of slave. Now, I think I've probably mentioned this to you before, and I don't normally use Bob Dylan as a theological example of the truth. But there was a time in Bob Dylan's career where he kind of found God. I don't know what you would call it. And I don't know whether he's a true believer or not. But he wrote a song that became a hit. And one of the lines in the song is that you're going to have to serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. That was in his song. Bob Dylan. Go look it up. Let AI give you the song title for it or whatever, You're going to have to serve somebody. So when we become idolatrous, we think we're going to gain our freedom because we're not going to have to serve God. I'm not going to be under the yoke. I'm not going to be under the burden of doing what God tells me to do. I'm just going to simply step right out of that situation. I'm going to give God's glory to something else. So what does Paul say here that mankind does in that process? Where do they go to replace God's glory? Huh? A sin, yeah, but I mean right in the verse. What does it say? Yeah. But what did they do? Look at verse 23. When they changed the glory of God, what did they do? How did they change it? Corruptible man, birds, four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Boy, man is so smart. Instead of worshiping the God of the universe, I'm going to make a statue of a person or a bird or, what does it say, or a four-footed beast or creeping things. You know what creeping things are? Reptiles. So, no, God, I'm going to make some kind of an image of these things, and I'm going to say, you are worthy because you are the creator of all things. Boy, we're smart, aren't we? Well, okay. This brings up an honest question, which I have in your outline, right? So, well, not quite there yet. So, when you turn to idolatry, you become a slave, and what you're really becoming a slave to is depraved ideas. That's what you're really becoming a slave to. If I reject God and His truth, His holiness, His righteousness, His purity, if I reject that, then I'm going to accept something else. And whatever is that something else, I guarantee you, it is depraved. It is everything that God is not. It is not pure. It is not righteous. It is not holy. It is all the things that God is not. And we become a slave to those things, and we almost force ourselves, once we start digging that hole, to dig it deeper and deeper and deeper. Does anybody see this happening in our society today in any way? How we're digging our own hole, and we're digging it deeper and deeper and deeper. If somebody told you 10 years ago that we cannot agree as a society in 100% fashion anymore what is a man and what is a woman, what would you have thought? You've heard people testifying before Congress and some of the politicians asking that question. Can you define a man or a woman? And they don't want to do it. And yet science is clear what a man and a woman is. You want to talk about the X and the X and the X and the Y? God created man and women in his own image. Actually, Genesis says God created man in his own image. And that first usage of the word man means male and female, because then he says both male and female created he, them. So when I use the term mankind, it is not an exclusive thing to the male sex. Mankind includes everybody. And so we just embrace these depraved ideas and dig our hole deeper and deeper and deeper. So then, now we get to the question. Paul tells us here that they began to worship the creature over the Creator. So my question is, why? Come on. I want to know why. Somebody tell me, why does mankind choose to worship the creature over the Creator?
Because they can visibly see it.
Okay, hang on. What's that? Okay, they can see it. Is that what you said?
That's what I was saying.
Yeah. Because they can see it?
And you don't see God.
You don't see God. Okay. Ah. Sharon's getting at it here. Yeah. Both ideas are true. It's easier to see, and what's one of the most, it blows my mind when I read in the Old Testament about God's chosen people and how God delivered them out of Egypt. And boy, when they're marching out of Egypt, they're all happy, right? Think of the Ten Commandments movie. Boy, they're all joyful, right? They're marching out of Egypt, out from underneath slavery. But pretty soon they get out there in the middle of the wilderness and they go, oh, where are we? What do we do? And then they find out Pharaoh's army is chasing them. And now all of a sudden they're upset. You brought us out here to die, Moses. So God miraculously saves them, parts the Red Sea. They go through. He destroys Pharaoh's army, and everything's good again for a while. Till Moses goes up on the mountain to talk to God. And the people didn't know where he was, or if they did know, they were like, man, when's he coming down? When's he coming down? So they were without a leader. And so what ended up happening? You tell me, what ended up happening? Okay. They became idolatrous in their thinking, and they became slaves to depraved activities and ideas. It turned into a great big sex orgy. And Aaron, Moses' right-hand man, they convinced Aaron, and if I'm Aaron, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking, you know what, they would have killed me if I hadn't done that. So what did Aaron do? He made a golden calf. He crafted it. There it is. There's your God that brought you up out of Egypt. You mean God's chosen people did exactly what Paul is talking about here? They changed God's glory into something else, the golden calf. Now, of course, Aaron, he had a time to think about this. When Moses came down from the mountain, what did Aaron tell Moses happened? Yeah, but even more ridiculous.
It just popped up out of
We got all this gold together, Moses, and we threw it in the fire, and out jumped this golden calf. That's what he told Moses. Got to tell him something. He wasn't here. He'll never know. Right? Man, this is God's people acting this way. Why would we ever think that the same thing doesn't happen today?
It's happening.
It is happening today. Even amongst some people who call themselves Christians. The same thing happens. So why do the creature more than the creator? Because if I do that, who was it that said it? I have the power, not God. So let's go to Acts 17. We were there last week too. But let's go back. This is that great sermon that Paul preached on Mars Hill in Athens, Greece. Verse 24 and 25. Remember, as Paul was going up there, he had been invited, or perhaps summoned, to go up there because there was a bunch of Greek philosophers. They would go up there and they would argue over different philosophies. And they heard about Paul. And they wanted to hear from Paul. So as Paul's going up to Mars Hill at the Acropolis in Athens, Greece, he's passing by all these altars that had been handcrafted by men to all the gods that the Greeks had. And I don't remember where I got the information when I studied this years ago, but I had it written in my other Bible all the time, 23,000 gods.
What?
Yeah. 23,000 gods. They had to, they felt compelled to have a god of this, a god of that, or whatever, a god of wind, fire, all this other stuff. Each god, they couldn't give him too much power. They were restricted. So as Paul's going up there, he passes one altar to a false god, and written on that altar was what? To the unknown God. These Greeks were so smart. They figured out that although we've got 23,000 gods, we might have left somebody out. So here, the altar to the unknown God. And when Paul saw that, the light bulb went on. Aha! And so when he got up there and started speaking, he said, hey, I saw all these altars, but I saw one that said to the unknown God. That's the one I'm going to tell you about. Beautiful, logical thinking process that Paul had here to bring the gospel message to them. So then, in this course that he's talking about the unknown God, he says in verse 24, God that made the world, what? The unknown God. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. He doesn't dwell in any man-made structure of any sort. He's not worshipped or served with men's hands as though he needed anything. Why, Paul? Because he gives to all life and breath and all things. So another primary essence of idolatry is that in our act of replacing or changing God's glory and putting it in some kind of an image to a beast or a man or whatever else, What we're really doing is taking away God's glory and putting it on ourselves. Because I have determined, I have decided that the God of wind controls the wind. I control God, not God controls me. And I think that is at the base of why people turn to idolatry. I am my own God. I answer to no one other than me. And I think you would agree we can see the evidence of that kind of mindset in our world today. Why is it when somebody's so deeply rooted in some of these sinful activities, they are totally 110% invested in that, and you tell them what God says, do they care?
Angry.
Yeah, they get angry. They don't care. They don't care what God says. No. I say, this is the way I should live. And there is idolatry. So we are in this situation where we are constantly changing over. So Acts 17, 24, and 25 is what we just went through there. We are changing, when we're replacing God's glory, we are changing the truth. Here we come back to it again. Whether we want to believe it, whether we want to recognize it, there is a truth. An ultimate, eternal truth. Where do we find eternal truth? We find that, as I hope you well know, in the person of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We find ultimate eternal truth in Him. And that truth does not change. It is rock solid, steadfast. Okay, let's continue on. So Paul says these people, they're changing the glory of God, and they're making images like all different kinds of animals. And now he turns to God's response, okay? Which is God's just wrath. Remember, he brought up the wrath of God in verse 18 of the first chapter of Romans. The wrath of God. And we talked about this. What do you think of? What's the common idea when we think of the wrath of God? Remember, what's the other word for wrath? Anger. So what is the common thought of an angry God?
The flood?
He's righteous, yeah. Well, the flood is an example of God's response to man's sinfulness, absolutely. Don't we think of, this idea of God up in heaven throwing lightning bolts down at people, zapping them? I'll tell you what, there are times in my life in which I wish God would do that to some of the people that have disrupted my life. I'm supposed to pray for them. Yeah, I prayed. God, zap them. No, that's probably not the incorrect interpretation of how I'm supposed to pray for these people, right?
Forgive them, for they know what to do.
Yeah. But more often than not, and as I dig into this chapter and contemplate it more and more, the example that we're about to see of God's wrath here in the first chapter of Romans, I think is probably the most common way we see God's response of anger. When people turn their back on Him, God responds, not by throwing lightning bolts, but by doing something else instead. Okay, so let's look. God's just wrath. I want you to look at some of these verses here, and you're going to see it. Paul says it over and over again. He says, verse 24, God's response. Wherefore God also gave them up. You can underline those words if you want. God gave them up. He says it again in verse 26. For this cause God gave them up. And he says it one more time. 28. God gave them over. Little variation, same idea. God gave them up, gave them up, gave them over. That's the response. That's God's just wrath. I don't think we're talking about here, and somebody, and in fact, many times I've seen people use these verse scriptures to say, this is the proof that God is going to condemn anybody who acts in this way to an eternal damnation in hell. I don't think that's the context of what he's talking about here. And let's remember, just like the children of Israel, God's chosen people, became idolatrous. He's talking to new believers in Jesus Christ who were living in a culture in Rome surrounded by idolatry that could very easily either retain some of that idolatry and bring it with them into Christianity, or return to idolatry from Christianity. And so, if he's not talking about immediate eternal judgment, then what is he talking about? The natural consequences. The natural consequences of man's reactions and actions when they reject God. There are natural consequences. I've talked to you about this before, right? When you're raising your kids, when they're little, at first you need to set them rules, and they don't need to understand why the rules are set. They get a little bit older, and they begin to understand, okay, this is why Mommy and Daddy don't want me to touch the hot stove, or stick my finger in the light socket, or play in the freeway. They begin to understand that. But after a while, when they get old enough, more and more, you release them to the law of natural consequences. So when they come running to you, whining and crying and complaining about something that happened because they made a bad choice, then you can start to teach those life lessons. And the bad choice that happened, or that creates bad outcomes and negative things in people's life, those choices come far before. Usually, they become far before what actually happened. So, the teenager, under the parents' guidance, says, you can go out, you can stay out till 11, but I don't want you to do this or that. I don't want you to climb in a car with anybody that's been drinking or anybody that you don't know. And then at 2 a.m., they get the phone call from the police, and their kid is either in the hospital or in jail. And the kid is whining and complaining about, I wasn't driving, I was just in the back seat. Yeah, but you made a bad choice to get in the car in the first place, to go against our advice to you. The bad choice always precedes the bad outcome. So this natural consequence of man's actions by turning his back on God is God's anger, his wrath. He just, okay, you want to live like that? Live like that. So where do we see this? Again, with those phrases, right? Verse 24, God gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts. And now he begins to zero in on a particular form of this. When he says to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And then he begins to explain he takes another pause in this, okay? Because he wants people to understand, if you abandon God and you turn to your own lusts, what you're doing, once again, is changing the truth of God. That's what he says here in verse 25. Who changed the truth of God into a lie. Who took that tactic in the very, very beginning of things? To who? In the garden with Eve. That's the exact tactic that Satan used. He changed the truth of God, turned it into a lie. People do the same thing when you turn your back on God and choose to worship and serve the creature more than the Creator who is blessed forever. This is Paul saying, this is what happens when you decide to do that. You decide to do that, and bad things start to happen. And now in verse 26, he gets back to this one specific example. God gave them up. Verse 26. Unto vile affections or passions, even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. Okay, homosexuality. That's what this is talking about. So, how do we deal with this? Well, obviously, Paul talked about this as an evidence of people turning their back on God, His truth. Okay, in the context of human sexuality, what is God's truth? Somebody tell me, what is God's truth? Is sex bad? No, it's not. So what is God's truth? There you go. I remember Roger Staubach. You remember who Roger Staubach was? Quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. Go Boys. Anyway, he, in the late 70s, gave an interview to a famous female correspondent. I forget who it was, but she was very famous. No, I don't think it was Barbara, but it was somebody of that stature. But anyway, and he said in the interview, he said, "Sex is not bad. I enjoy sex. It's great with my wife." And boy, that made headlines because he confined it to the marital relationship. That's God's truth. Has mankind stepped over that line? A little. Now, the thing that we need to be careful about is to single out homosexuality and only homosexuality as an example of man stepping over the line of God's truth involving human sexual behavior. That's not the only thing. Never was, never will be. As far as, the only way in which we have what we refer to as, in the old King James, you read the word fornication. That's sexual sin. And that can be all manner. And believe you me, there are sexual sins that you and I have never been exposed to that exist today that would it would disturb your mind. the way in which this has happened. Okay? So, we're talking about here, Paul is bringing this out. Now, why do you think Paul is talking about homosexuality from the female perspective and the male perspective? Why do you think he's talking about that in the first century to first century young believers in Rome? It existed. Homosexuality is not a 20th century thing. Sure, absolutely. Yeah, the men of Lot wanted to have sex with the angels that came and to deliver Lot out of that city. Nothing new under the sun, right? So, it was prevalent then. Now, what has changed? They came out of the closet. So what does that mean? It's tolerated, it's okay, it's the norm. Yeah. And you see, and this is how it starts. I'm running out of time. At first, those people that are involved in that lifestyle, at first they're saying, all we want is to be left alone. That's where it started. And then they go from that to, all we want is our human rights. And then it went from that to, we demand equality in all things, which includes, we demand that you recognize my lifestyle as just as right and natural as any other lifestyle. And it just keeps going further and further and further. That's how these things kind of develop. So anyway, Paul says, listen, it is the natural consequences, and one of those things that he talks about is the homosexuality. Mankind, we need to go back to this and understand that mankind is a free moral agent. That's a theological term to describe what? A free moral agent. You get to do what? Choose. You get to choose. Yeah. Free moral agent. And you know what? Some of the phrases that we hear is that, I'm probably going to not say it right, but the idea is, you love whoever you want to love. What's that? Yeah, that was a rock and roll song when I was a teenager. If you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. You remember that song? Yeah. Everything starts, right? Starts somewhere. We're free, we get to choose. And so the consequences, again, of that choice is an entirely different matter. Now, let me say one other thing really quick, okay? I personally believe there's a difference between a practicing homosexual and somebody who may, for whatever reason, have what they refer to as a same-sex attraction. I think there's a difference there. Somebody who has a same-sex attraction, who is not a practicing homosexual, they're on the brink, and they need to turn their eyes to the Lord. And I know of Christians, I've read about believers in Jesus Christ who have a same-sex attraction, who have for their whole lives said no to that attraction because they know what the Word of God says. And they choose to say no to that natural attraction they have. Sometimes God has taken away that attraction. Other times he has not. It's almost like, the alcoholic who constantly has to say no to alcohol. There are some people who claim, as they were an alcoholic, that God took the desire away from them for alcohol completely. The others is saying, no, I'm going to live with this for the rest of my life. I'm going to have this desire in me. I'm just going to push that desire down and say no. It's almost like that. All right. So anyway, what's next? Yes. Uh-huh. Sure. Absolutely. That's right. That's right. So they want to normalize it, and we've gone from the issue of homosexuality with that to the issue of gender identity. Same thing.
It's funny because they use the term "live your truth."
Live your truth. There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Believe me, there is no limit to the depravity with which mankind will dig themselves a hole when they turn their back on God. There's no limit to this. It'll just get worse and worse and worse. Okay. So, so mankind's a free moral agent, but the part we don't think about is that as a free moral agent, if you make a bad choice, it will lead to servitude. Bob Dylan. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. That's what it leads to. All right. Sorry I'm taking so long here with it. The results of being slaves to sin. Here is, down to the end of the chapter, is this huge laundry list that Paul begins to explain of this. And he starts with sexual sin, okay, and that's what we've already talked about. He talks about that sexual sin, first of all, and along with the natural consequences. Now, people don't like to think about this, but what is there is a uniqueness, I'll put it this way, there is a uniqueness to the sexual sin of homosexuality. What is that uniqueness? The natural consequences leads to what? Did you ever say that to somebody who's homosexual? If everybody was a homosexual, you wouldn't be here. Right? Yeah, what else? Physical sickness. So the big one that hit in the 80s, right? AIDS. And people, and a lot of the hardcore, preachers were saying, AIDS is God's punishment to homosexuality. Well, I can't absolutely disagree with that, but I would put it in a different context, and that is, AIDS is the natural consequences of somebody who lives in that lifestyle. Eventually, you can find yourself, and that's exactly what Paul talked about in these verses. They sow in their own bodies, the consequences of that lifestyle, okay? It is a condemned mind, devoid of God. Look at verse 28. Condemned mind, void of God, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. You don't want to accept me, you don't want to acknowledge me as who I really am? Okay. I'm going to let you live the way you want to live without any thought of God anymore, and we'll see what happens. We'll just see what happens. And what happens? We don't have, like I said, we don't have time to talk about all this stuff. But we're talking about unrighteousness, verse 29, wickedness, covetousness, malice, envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents. Do all those things sound as bad as some of the others? If you're going to say that God condemns to hell anybody that does any of these things, then anybody who's disobedient to their parents is going to burn forever. That's in there, isn't it? Disobedient to parents. So what is the true context? This is what happens when you don't retain God in your knowledge, in your mind. God gives you over And why is that? Because of the curse. Thank you, Adam. Right? Because of the curse. The consequences of the curse. What was the natural way that we saw the consequences of the sin of Adam after they sinned? What happened to them? They were cast out of the Garden of Eden. Separated. Now we know that because of faith, they came back into a spiritual union with God, but they were cast out of that garden. They didn't live in that garden for the rest of their lives. All right. So he goes into the laundry list of sins, and that is basically an attitude of defiance and justification. You can justify anything if you try hard enough. And there it is, 4 minutes over.